They dragged Colonel Darius Holloway into court like a criminal, hands-cuffed, dignity-stripped, no one caring who he was. But he wasn't just a man in shackles. He was a war hero, a silent storm, and across the room the white cop who arrested him stood proud, unaware he'd just chained a legend. When a decorated Black Army colonel is humiliated in open court, what does real justice look like? What would you have done if you were Darius? Let us know below then, like, share, and hit subscribe, because what happens next will flip the whole room. I remember that morning like it was yesterday. The room was already half full. Law students, local reporters, a couple of folks just killing time. Nothing unusual. Until the back doors opened, and everything changed. They brought him in with shackles on his wrists and ankles. A tall black man, gray around the temples suit, rumpled but dignified, like he'd put it on himself, not for the court, but for who he knew he was. His name, Darius Holloway. I'd never seen him before, but I couldn't take my eyes off him, and I wasn't the only one. The deputy announced him dryly, like reading off a lunch order. Defendant Darius Holloway, charged with obstruction of a law enforcement officer. Obstruction. That's what they said he did at a park of all places. Supposedly interfered with police action, but no one was injured. No weapons, just resistance. Quiet, calm resistance. He didn't speak when they brought him in, just walked steady like those shackles were made of paper. Sat down at the defense table and didn't even glance at the public defender standing by. The judge, a man with more coffee stains than compassion in his robes, looked down and asked if Mr. Holloway would be accepting counsel. That's when he spoke. Just once. I've been in enough courts to know the silence speaks better. It wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. But it hit that room like a hammer. I could see Officer Rick Stanton across the aisle, the young white cop who arrested him, shifting in his seat like he had something to prove. His arms were crossed tight, eyes locked on Darius, jaw clenched with that smugness you see in men who mistake power for righteousness. Rick had made sure everyone in town heard about this troublemaker at the park. Told his buddies it was just another mouthy old vet who forgot his place. But sitting there now, Rick looked small, almost nervous. Still, he wore that look, the one that says, I got the badge. I own the truth. A few seats down from me sat Evelyn Brooks, one of the judicial oversight observers. White hair pulled back and a neat twist red scarf notebook always in hand. She'd been to hundreds of hearings, but that day, something shifted in her too. I saw her lean forward the moment Darius walked in. Her pen stopped moving. Her eyes narrowed not in suspicion, but recognition. She knew something the rest of us didn't. The court clerk began reading through the case log, legal language dull and sterile. But I wasn't listening to that. I was watching Darius. His eyes didn't follow the papers or the people. They were fixed steadily on the national emblem behind the judge's seat. The eagle, the shield, the phrase e pluribus unum. Not fear, not hope, just presence. Like he wasn't there to be judged, but to judge who was watching. You could feel the tension building low and slow, like a string pulled tight under a violin. No one had raised their voice, no gavel slammed yet. But somehow, it already felt like something bigger than a hearing was underway. What struck me most wasn't what he said. It was how much he chose not to say. No defense, no protest, just presence. And maybe that's why people started shifting in their seats. Why Evelyn closed her notebook and just watched. Why Rick, for all his swagger, suddenly wouldn't meet Darius's eyes. Because deep down we all knew there was more to this man than the file said. Much more. And the question hanging in the air wasn't, what did he do? It was who. Exactly did we just put in shackles? The prosecutor called their first witness, Rick Stanton. He rose quickly, crisp in his uniform, stepping like he was walking onto a stage. His eyes flicked around the courtroom, quick check to make sure the audience was watching. They were. Rick took the stand and swore in like he'd done it a dozen times. He adjusted the mic. cleared his throat. And then, like flipping a switch, his face tightened into seriousness. On the morning of June 3rd, around 9:15 a.m., I responded to a disturbance at Lincoln Park. His voice was steady, practiced. There was a group of young men gathered near the basketball courts. One of them, a black male around 16, was yelling at officers and refusing to comply with verbal commands. He continued claiming the boy was becoming physically aggressive, that officers moved in to de-escalate. That's when, according to Rick, Darius Holloway stepped forward. He wasn't involved in the incident. He wasn't a parent. He just walked right into the scene, started shouting at officers, told us to back off and act right. He paused there, looked to the jury. Then he raised his hand, pointed at me, said I was the reason young black men get shot. Murmurs in the room. The prosecutor stood still, hands behind her back, watching Rick feed the fire. He got too close. Rick went on. It was threatening. He raised his arms like he was about to strike. The word strike landed with weight. But there was no body cam footage, no park surveillance, and no bystanders willing to come forward. Just Rick's statement and the quiet nod of Officer Davis, who'd been there too, but said nothing. The prosecutor tried to patch that hole. Officer Stanton, did you feel threatened? Yes, ma'am. He was belligerent, unpredictable. I did what I had to protect my team. She asked about Darius's background, hoping to cast a shadow. Any history of resisting authority? Rick hesitated just half a second too long. Not officially, but he had an attitude, you could tell. That's when it started to crack. The silence in the room wasn't trust. It was suspicion. No charges, no record, just an attitude. Evelyn Brooks leaned back in her seat, fingers tapping her chin. She was staring now, not at Rick, not at the judge, but at Darius. Something in his posture, something in his stillness. She knew that face. Or rather, she knew that kind of face. He wasn't someone you forget. Not if you'd ever worked around classified hearings, military oversight, or federal security boards. Not if you'd ever seen a man choose restraint over pride because the consequences of the opposite were too steep. And Darius Holloway, whatever else he was, sat without twitching, without blinking, like the accusations weren't thorns but ash. Then came the moment no one expected. The judge asked if he had anything to say in response. Darius stood up slowly. No anger, no appeal. He faced the courtroom and said, I came here to be judged, not to explain. It wasn't defiance. It was something deeper, like a man who'd spent years being misread and finally stopped trying to correct the story. I remember Evelyn tilting her head, lips parting slightly, like a door had opened just a crack. Something about that voice, that way of standing, that phrase. Her eyes narrowed. She turned toward Rick. Studied him now, not as a cop on the stand, but as a boy performing too hard. And across the aisle I saw Officer Davis still seated beside the prosecutor. Older, slower, with a tired stiffness in his hands. He wasn't nodding. He wasn't scowling. He just looked unsure. His eyes followed Rick's hands as he gestured. They lingered when Darius turned to sit back down, and for the briefest moment his lips tightened, not in anger, but in thought. He'd seen something that didn't sit right, but he said nothing. And that silence said everything. Because sometimes the loudest truth in a courtroom is the one someone chooses not to speak. The cameras weren't inside the courtroom, but the tension could have charged the air like a thunderstorm. Reporters had gathered outside, hanging on every leak and whisper. It didn't take long before a quote from Officer Rick Stanton made its way into the local news feed. He thinks he's better than us. I saw that look in his eyes. It was quick, brutal, personal. Inside, Darius Holloway sat still, unmoved, unreadable. His wrists still bore the faint marks of the handcuffs, though they'd been removed before court began. The prosecutor called it standard restraint. Rick called it necessary control. Some in the crowd didn't blink, but others started shifting in their seats. He wouldn't talk. He wouldn't cooperate. Rick testified confidently from the stand. He raised his hand when I told him to stay back. He was interfering. He had that look like he was daring me not to do my job. The prosecutor nodded, feeding him with more. And how would you describe his attitude? Rick didn't hesitate. Defiant, disrespectful, threatening. There it was, the trifecta, enough to paint a black man as a threat in one clean stroke. But there was no video. No bystanders had come forward, and the young man Rick had protected had disappeared the day after the arrest. Still, the court didn't seem to care. Darius sat in silence, hands clasped, eyes steady. When asked if he wanted to respond, he simply said, "I came here to be judged, not to explain." It wasn't arrogance. It was restraint, a kind of calm that rattled even the walls. From the gallery, Evelyn Brooks leaned forward just slightly. She was a woman who had spent 3 decades watching courtroom procedures, most of which blurred together after a while. But this man didn't blur. She typed his name again into her phone. Darius Holloway. Nothing. No public record. No criminal history. Not even a LinkedIn. It was like the man never existed until now, and that bothered her. To her left, Sergeant Davis shifted in his seat, a seasoned cop with gray streaks in his hair and creases around his eyes that told stories of nights too long and choices too heavy. He didn't say a word, but his gaze hadn't left Darius since the trial began. There was something in that man's stillness, something he couldn't place. His memory fumbled back through time like a file cabinet. That face, that posture, the way the man's shoulders stayed square even while seated. He'd seen it before at a ceremony, maybe where brass gleamed and metals clicked like whispers of valor. Couldn't be, though. Could it? The judge glanced up, irritated by the slow pace. Since the defendant refuses to clarify or mount a defense, we will proceed with the next phase of argument. His voice echoed off the wooden walls, sterile and sharp. The crowd sat like pressed cloth, no rustling, no breath. Rick leaned back slightly in his chair, a small smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He thought it was going well. Darius didn't flinch. He didn't turn toward Rick, didn't raise an eyebrow. He simply lifted his chin barely and looked up at the seal of the court hanging above the judge's head. The golden eagle holding arrows. The scale of justice resting atop its wings. His eyes didn't tremble. You could feel it in the room, like something sacred had just been broken. Like someone had dared to believe this room still meant something. And maybe that's what unsettled everyone most. Not his silence, but his dignity. The courtroom had quieted after lunch. People returned to their benches with coffee cups and heavy eyelids, expecting nothing more than the usual legal drudgery. But a storm was coming, and its first crack came not from the gavel, but from a uniform. Officer Rick Stanton didn't wait for permission. He rose with calculated ease, straightened his tie, and approached the defense table where Darius Holloway sat still and cuffed to the chair. "I need to perform a threat posture check," Rick announced loudly, projecting authority for all to hear. The judge didn't lift his eyes from the papers. There was no order, no call for action. Rick was acting alone, and everyone knew it. Darius didn't look up. He sat calmly, wrists resting on the table, still locked together from the morning's session. "You're not the law," Darius said, voice low and smooth. "You're a man in a suit." Rick bristled. "Get up." Darius didn't move. "I won't be moved without cause." There was no threat, no movement, just 2 men, one fueled by pride, the other grounded in something deeper. But Rick couldn't let it go. He grabbed Darius by the shoulder and yanked him to his feet. The clink of metal slicing through silence was deafening. Gasps filled the courtroom as Rick slapped a second set of cuffs on Darius, this time behind his back. Even the bailiff looked unsure. "What is this?" Evelyn Brooks's voice rose from the public seating. She shot up, finger pointed. "This is unlawful." The judge banged his gavel. "Ms. Brooks, sit down." But Evelyn didn't move. She stared, eyes burning. Rick began dragging Darius toward the gallery past rows of stunned onlookers. It was unnecessary, cruel showmanship in uniform. Darius didn't struggle. He walked hands bound behind him, chin high. A child whispered, "Why is he bleeding?" Blood had begun to trickle from Darius's wrist, the metal biting into his skin. Each drop landed on the polished wood with a soft tap. Clink, clink, clink. Rick didn't look at the audience, but he felt them watching, judging. Yet he smirked. To him, this was dominance. Evelyn stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. She'd seen hundreds of hearings, but this was different. This wasn't protocol. This was punishment. And Darius, he didn't seem afraid. If anything, he looked resolute. Officer Davis, seated on the far right, shifted in his chair. Something about Darius's face stirred an old memory, a ceremony, a salute, a name that hadn't been spoken in years. But the uniform he was picturing had medals, valor, honor. He blinked it away. When Rick reached the courtroom doors, Darius suddenly stopped. "Look at them," he said, quiet but clear. Rick frowned. "What?" Darius tilted his head slightly, nodding back toward the gallery. "Look. At them." Rick turned confused. Then he saw. Everyone was standing now, silent. Men, women, children. Black, white, old, young. Their eyes weren't fearful. They were ashamed. Ashamed for watching this unfold and doing nothing. Darius turned to Rick. "That's your threat posture." Rick opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a few seconds, the room held its breath. The judge, clearly rattled, called a recess. 10 minutes. Clear the courtroom. But no one moved, not immediately. They stayed where they were, as if glued to the floor by something deeper than surprise, something closer to reverence. Rick escorted Darius out the side door. As it shut behind them, the lingering sound of chains echoed one last time. Clink. And that was the moment the courtroom changed. Not with shouting, not with force, but with stillness. With a man who didn't flinch. With a silence louder than any siren. It was during the recess that Evelyn Brooks stepped outside the courtroom, her hands trembling as she scrolled through her phone. The hum of fluorescent lights in the hallway faded into background noise. Her thumb hovered over a name in her contacts. "Arthur," she said as soon as the call picked up. "Evie." Her husband's voice crackled with concern. "You all right?" "It's him," she whispered. "It's Darius Holloway." A long pause. "From Kandahar." "Yes." The silence on the other end was heavy. Then, "Are you sure I saw the way he stood? The way he didn't flinch, not even when they cuffed him?" "Arthur, no one forgets a man like that." She turned toward a quiet bench in the hallway, lowering herself slowly. He was the one who pulled those Marines out under fire, wasn't he? When the convoy was ambushed? He was more than that. Arthur said, his voice turning solemn. "He held that damn ridge for 6 hours alone. Gave us the cover we needed. That man saved my life." Evelyn's throat tightened. "He's sitting in there like a criminal." Arthur exhaled. "You need to be careful. If that really is Colonel Holloway, something's very wrong." She nodded to herself and hung up. No more waiting. She opened her laptop right there in the hallway, her fingers tapping faster than her breath. She drafted an urgent email to a contact she hadn't reached out to in years. Someone who still had access to Pentagon archives. Subject line, request for identity confirmation. Urgent. Attached courtroom timestamp, brief description, and a question that weighed heavy in her chest. "Is this Colonel Darius Holloway back inside the courtroom?" Officer Davis leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Rick Stanton with a growing knot in his chest. Rick was pacing, jaw tight, his ego still riding the wave from earlier. He noticed Davis's stare. What Rick snapped. Davis nodded slightly toward the empty defense table. "You sure you know who you cuffed back there?" Rick chuckled, but it was hollow. "I know trash when I see it." Davis didn't smile. He didn't say anything more, but something in his gut stirred. That man's eyes. They didn't belong to some street protester. They belonged to someone who had seen real battles. Someone who had survived more than this courtroom would ever understand. Back in the gallery, people were beginning to murmur. Something was off, and they could feel it. The way Darius carried himself, the eerie silence he maintained, the blood on the floor wiped but not forgotten. Even the stenographer had stopped typing at moments just to look at him. The courtroom, which had earlier been filled with scoffs and smirks, now carried a different energy like the air before a storm. Whispers circulated. Did you see how he looked at Rick? He didn't blink. Who is he really? Evelyn walked back in just as the judge returned. She took her seat quietly, her eyes sharper now. No longer confused, no longer uncertain. She knew. And she knew the courtroom was about to learn the truth, whether it was ready or not. It happened during a lull. No testimony, no questioning. Just a stillness in the courtroom so heavy you could feel it pressing against your chest. Rick Stanton leaned forward slightly in his chair, arms crossed, a sly smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. He whispered just loud enough for Darius to hear. Maybe you used to bark orders in the jungle, huh? Colonel? His eyes glittered with mockery. Bet those medals feel real far away now. For a second, the air snapped like a rubber band. Darius's fingers gripped the wooden armrest tight. His knuckles turned bone white. He rose from his seat halfway like a tide beginning to swell. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. Rick smirked, waiting for the explosion. But it didn't come. Darius stopped. His hand reached slowly into the inner pocket of his jacket. No sudden moves, just a careful, deliberate motion. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, faded, wrinkled at the edges, like something kept too long, touched too often. He unfolded it quietly, held it in his lap. A short note handwritten in cursive, barely legible now with age, his wife's handwriting. Silence doesn't mean surrender. It means strength waits. Darius took in a breath. Deep, centered. And then, in a voice that felt heavier than the silence before it, he looked up, not at Rick, but directly at the judge. I waited long enough, he said. The courtroom didn't know how to respond. Even the judge, who had been tapping impatiently a moment earlier, paused with her gavel raised mid-air. Rick's smirk faded. Darius didn't raise his voice, didn't shout. But something about the way he said it made the room feel smaller, like the walls had suddenly moved in a few inches. On the far side of the courtroom, Officer Davis turned toward him slowly. His hand hovered over his laptop. His fingers trembled as he typed. Something was wrong. He could feel it now in his chest. This wasn't some protester who got loud at a park. This wasn't some unstable veteran looking to pick a fight. This was something else, and he had a sickening feeling they were on the wrong side of it. In the back row, Evelyn Brooks watched all of it unfold. She didn't speak, didn't blink, but her breathing had quickened. The Pentagon hadn't replied yet, but she didn't need their confirmation anymore. She'd seen enough. The way Darius calmed the storm inside him, how he returned to himself in a moment when any man would have snapped. That wasn't weakness. That was discipline honed over decades, and pain buried even deeper. She turned toward Rick, now shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He doesn't even realize what he's done, she thought. He thinks he broke a man, but he just woke him up. Back at the defense table, Darius folded the note carefully, with both hands, despite the pain in his wrists. He placed it gently back in his pocket, and then he waited, not for justice, not for apology, but for the moment when truth, like all things buried, would rise. The courtroom had settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind of silence that didn't come from calm but from something heavy waiting to drop. Then it happened. The double doors creaked open. In stepped a tall woman in a navy blue uniform, ribbons sharp on her chest cap tucked under one arm. Captain Rivera didn't hesitate. She walked with purpose straight down the center aisle, heels clicking on polished tile like a metronome, counting down to something none of them were ready for. The bailiff stepped toward her, confused. Rivera simply held up a red-sealed folder. "For the judge. It's urgent." Judge Renshaw, who had just finished asking the prosecution whether they wanted to escalate charges, blinked clearly, caught off guard. She leaned forward as the folder was handed to her. The red seal. Everyone saw it. Eyes widened. The Department of Defense. The courtroom that once hummed with the smug breath of assumed power now held its breath. As Judge Renshaw broke the seal and flipped open the folder, the room seemed to tilt. She read slowly, silently, but her face said everything. Her proud, narrowed expression cracked, then dissolved completely. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. That's when Darius Holloway stood. No theatrics, no raised voice. Just a quiet clarity that settled over the room like a hush at a funeral. He reached into his coat pocket, the same pocket that had held the folded letter from his wife, and pulled out something firm and dark. A badge. He held it up high. "Colonel Darius Holloway," he said, his voice deep, even. "Retired. 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment." He turned slightly, eyes meeting the stunned crowd, then looked squarely at Rick Stanton. "Commendation Valor under fire," he added. Rick didn't move, didn't blink. His jaw hung slightly open like a man still trying to find a way out of a dream he didn't want to be in. From behind the witness stand, Davis straightened. His hand, the same one that had tightened cuffs around Darius's wrists, slowly lifted and reached for his keys. He stepped forward, quiet, almost reverent. Darius held his gaze but said nothing. Click. The cuffs opened. Davis didn't speak. He only offered a soft, almost broken "sir." Darius nodded once, not angry, not triumphant, just steady. Then Rivera took a step closer. Her voice crisp and respectful, "Colonel. I apologize for the delay. We had to confirm the request before intervening. The Pentagon was alerted an hour ago by a civilian, Evelyn Brooks." She acted fast. Gasps broke the stillness. All eyes turned to Evelyn. She sat, lips trembling, hand still hovering near her phone. She didn't try to hide her tears. "I remember Kandahar," she whispered. Darius turned to her. Just a nod. But in that nod lived 100 things. Respect. Memory, shared fire, shared silence. Back at the bench, Judge Renshaw was still holding the file, but her hands were shaking now. The confidence that had laced her voice minutes earlier had evaporated. She opened her mouth. "Colonel Holloway, No need," Darius interrupted softly. "Let the system finish what it started." That silence again. But this time it wasn't unease. It was respect. Even fear. The kind of fear that comes when power realizes it's been swinging blindly and just punched a ghost it should have saluted. Rick finally spoke. His voice cracked. You didn't say anything. All this time, why didn't you say who you were?" Darius looked at him. Calm. "I didn't think it would matter. And that was the test." Rick stumbled back. This is a setup." Rivera turned her eyes to him, cold and commanding. "No, Officer Stanton. This is a reckoning." The courtroom had changed. You could feel it. Like a tide turning. People who had chuckled earlier now sat stiff. Some looked ashamed. Others just stunned. Davis returned to his seat, folding his hands. His eyes didn't leave Darius again. Evelyn leaned toward the young woman next to her, whispering something about honor, about how names get forgotten, but deeds don't. And in the center of it all stood Darius Holloway. No longer shackled, no longer silent. Just a man who had chosen to wait. And when he rose, the whole room felt it. A name they forgot, but would never forget again. The air inside the courtroom had shifted. It wasn't just quiet, it was reverent. Like a church where something sacred had just happened. Evelyn stood slowly. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held up her phone, reading aloud an email that had come just minutes ago. "It's from the Department of Defense," she said. Her voice was steady but soft. A letter of formal acknowledgement. She paused, swallowing.
Bay.
Confirming that Colonel Darius Holloway, retired, is credited with saving the lives of 17 American soldiers during a nighttime ambush near Kandahar in 2009. A hush spread through the room. Even the reporters put down their pens. Evelyn's eyes swept the courtroom. They wrote, "We owe him a debt this nation cannot repay." No one spoke. And then from the back row, a soft voice broke the silence. A young man, maybe in his early 20s, barely audible. He stood and made us sit down. His words hung in the air, simple but devastating. Rick Stanton sat stiff in his chair, eyes locked somewhere in the distance. His face was pale. His jaw clenched, but no words came out. For the first time that day, he looked small, like someone who'd finally realized what he'd done, too late to undo any of it. Davis, who had once stood beside him, now barely acknowledged his presence. He passed Rick without so much as a glance, as though the man next to him was no longer a brother in uniform, but a stranger who'd broken something sacred. And maybe he had. Judge Renshaw slowly removed her glasses. Her tone, sharp earlier, had softened. "This court," she said, "is not in a position to judge a man whose life speaks louder than any witness." She turned to Darius, who stood tall, calm, unbothered. "We end this proceeding immediately. The charges are dismissed. And, Colonel—" She hesitated, as if still unsure how to speak to him. "Now you are free to go." Darius didn't nod, didn't smile. He simply turned to walk. There was no applause, no fanfare. But something more powerful happened. As he reached the center aisle, one by one, people began to rise. Not because the judge had left, not because the court clerk signaled them to stand, but because something inside each of them whispered it was the only decent thing to do. Even the reporters rose. The clerk, the court guards, everyone, not out of celebration, out of shame, out of respect, out of the ache that comes when you realize you almost let silence become injustice. Darius passed Rick without a word, without a glance. He didn't need to. His dignity had already said everything. Rick didn't stand, couldn't. His body was frozen in a chair that now felt too big for him, like a uniform he no longer deserved to wear. Evelyn, still standing, watched Darius approach the exit. She placed a hand over her heart, not in ceremony, but in remembrance. Outside, the light poured through the old courthouse windows, casting long shadows on the floor. And for a brief moment, as Darius Holloway stepped into the sun, it felt like the whole room exhaled. Not because justice had won, but because for once it hadn't lost. The courthouse lobby was quiet, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick like the hush that comes after a storm, but before people dare to step outside. Reporters swarmed Darius as he exited the courtroom. Cameras clicked microphones angled close. One of them, a young woman with nervous hands and a hopeful face, leaned in. "Colonel Holloway," she asked softly, "do you want Officer Rick held accountable? Should he be punished for what he did?" Darius paused, eyes scanning the crowd, not to seek approval, but to look each person in the face. Then he answered, his voice calm even. "I didn't come here to punish anyone," he said. "I came here on trial." But they stood in judgment. He didn't have to say who they were. Everyone understood. And somehow it wasn't just about the officers or the judge or even the courtroom. It was about everyone who had watched and done nothing. The reporter lowered her mic. She didn't ask another question. Just then, Officer Davis stepped forward. He removed his cap, not as part of any procedure, but out of something deeper. Respect, or maybe guilt. He looked Darius in the eye. "Sir, I've already submitted a request to be transferred," Davis said, voice slightly hoarse. "I'll be moving to ethics and training for new recruits. Thought maybe I could help them see better than I did." Darius nodded once. Then you've already begun. No handshake, no dramatic music, just two men who finally saw each other for who they really were. Far behind them, Rick stood alone near a bench by the exit. The weight of his badge now felt heavier than ever, though it was still pinned to his chest. His shoulders sagged, no longer squared with arrogance, but rounded with quiet shame. The next morning, a resignation letter sat on the department captain's desk. Rick hadn't spoken to anyone when he turned it in. No one asked him to stay. No one said goodbye. In the days that followed, the video of the courtroom spread online, but not the shouting or the chaos. The clip people kept sharing showed only one thing: Darius standing still, silent, eyes steady, while others scrambled around him. A young law student at the back of the courtroom wrote on her blog that evening, "He stood and made us sit down." Evelyn, sitting at her desk later that night, opened her laptop and began typing. She didn't write as a lawyer. She wrote as a citizen. Her post went viral before morning. "Some men fight wars," she wrote. "Others fight to remind us why wars should never happen here." And then she added a sentence simple, quiet, and hard to forget. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the loudest call for justice. When Darius returned home, his porch light was on. A small package lay on his front step. Inside was a letter, no return address, just a single line. "You reminded us. We won't forget again." He folded it slowly, placed it on the table beside his wife's photograph, and looked out into the night. It was a quiet afternoon in the same park where everything began. The air was still, almost like it was listening. Darius Holloway sat alone on a wooden bench just a few yards from the playground. Children's laughter echoed across the field. The same kind of laughter that had once been interrupted by confusion, fear, and handcuffs. But now, it filled the space freely, like it belonged. Darius leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. His face was calm but not distant. He wasn't remembering the trial. He was remembering peace. And what it cost. A boy, maybe 7, maybe 8, ran up with a plastic sword in one hand and dirt on his cheek. He stopped in front of Darius, curious, breathless. "Were you a hero?" the boy asked, eyes wide. Darius smiled, slow and warm. "No," he said. "I was just standing where I should." The boy blinked, unsure of what that meant, but he nodded like it mattered, then ran off to join the others. Across town in a police academy classroom, Davis stood at the front of his first ethics training session. The room was filled with young recruits, clean uniforms, restless hands, too much pride in some eyes, not enough understanding in others. Without a word, Davis pressed a button. A photograph appeared on the screen. Darius in court, standing tall, eyes forward, hands cuffed, unshaken. "This Davis began is Colonel Darius Holloway." He paused, letting the silence work. He never shouted. But everyone heard him. No one spoke. No one needed to. The recruits were listening not just to the story, but to what it meant to be accountable, to be human. Somewhere on the edge of town, Rick sat alone in a small apartment. His badge was gone. His uniform folded and boxed. There were no visitors, no interviews, just time and silence. He'd tried once to write an apology, but halfway through he tore the paper and tossed it in the trash. Not because he didn't mean it, but because he still didn't know where to begin. His name slowly faded from conversation. People stopped asking where he went. It wasn't revenge, it was forgetting, and maybe that was heavier. Back in the courtroom weeks later, Evelyn walked in one last time. The case was over, but something in her needed to sit where it all unfolded. She stood for a moment at the entrance, then walked to the front row, right where she had once jumped to her feet, and shouted, "This is unlawful!" But now there was no shouting, just the soft creak of old wooden floors and the hum of distant traffic outside. She looked to the bench, to the empty seat once filled with judgment. The room felt larger now, brighter. different. And then she noticed it. On the table in front of the bench under the morning sunlight streaming through the high windows lay a single pair of handcuffs unlocked. Polished. Still. No guards. No fanfare. Just the weight of memory. She didn't take a photo. She didn't post about it. She just sat, and for a long time said nothing. Because sometimes silence doesn't mean the story ends, it means it lingers where it matters most. And as Darius Holloway stood up from his park bench and began to walk home, the sky above seemed to stretch a little wider. Not for a hero, but for a man who never shouted, and still made the world stop to listen. And if this story moved you, even just a little, then maybe it did its job. Because the colonel who never shouted wasn't just about a courtroom or a man in uniform. It was about dignity, in silence power, without rage, and the kind of strength that stands not to be seen, but to remind us what justice truly looks like. Here at Mr. Max Stories, we believe that stories can change minds if they're told with heart. So if you felt something today, please don't keep it to yourself. Tap that like button, share this story with someone who needs it, and hit subscribe to stay with us for more powerful human stories like this one. Your support means the world to us. Every comment, every share, every new subscriber gives our team the motivation to keep going, to keep digging deeper, writing better, and giving voice to stories that deserve to be heard. Because at Mr. Max Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember the ones the world tries to forget. Thanks for being here. We'll see you in the next one.